Bruxelles,
Paris, Madrid.
Hi, I'm Hermine. From the outset, there have been many complaints with the European Union that the Green Deal, which aims to decarbonise the European economy, is harming the competitiveness of our industries. What is the situation today? What prospects do our companies have, and what solutions are in sight? The Green Deal is a European plan aimed at making the economy, energy sector, transport and industries more sustainable in order to limit climate change. The objective is to reduce emissions by at least 50% by 2030 and to achieve full carbon neutrality by 2050. It is true that energy prices in Europe are currently significantly higher than in other major economies, at roughly double those in the United States and 50% higher than in China and India. This situation is due on the most part to geopolitical factors. The EU has always been dependent on oil and gas imports, which would not be a problem in a peaceful world of relatively fair trade. Yet this dependence has proved to be a major weakness against the backdrop of disruptions to the European economy. First, the drop in Russian fossil fuel supplies since 2022, and then the war in the Middle East, and with the so-called perma-crisis we're in right now, the permanent crisis, it looks like this is here to stay. However, there may be hope on the horizon. Researchers at the International Energy Agency have found that existing wind and solar capacity has reduced Europe's dependence on fossil fuel imports, lowered wholesale electricity prices, and made countries with a higher share of renewable energy, again, less vulnerable to gas price volatility. This is why, says Europe's former Environment Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevicius, the whole debate about the EU's use of fossil fuels comes down to one basic point.
Why can't it be dependent on fossil fuels? This is elementary. We simply do not have them. If we had oil and gas deposits, everything would be fine, and this would be more of an ideological discussion. Now it is not ideological in the slightest. But the matter is very simple. Our dependence on fossil fuels is what most undermines our competitiveness. The Green Deal is actually a competitiveness opportunity, because its basis is to secure energy production in Europe.
So could the Green Deal in fact be good for our industrial future? This is the assertion of Romanian MEP Ștefan Mușoiu from the Socialist and Democrats group in the European Assembly.
The green transition is a long-term policy anchored in law, financing and sectoral reforms. Crises have only accelerated it and reframed it as a project of security and competitiveness, without changing its strategic direction.
The phasing out of fossil fuels makes even more sense these days, as data from the IEA, the Energy Agency, shows that new power plants running on renewables are cheaper than those running on oil or gas, making them the more competitive option. From one crisis to the next, most of the European industry has accepted that electrification is not a far-fetched luxury, but rather a necessity. Electrification means replacing fossil fuel sources with locally produced electricity from principally wind and solar power. The EU's vision has also evolved. The emissions trading scheme, an early cap-and-trade mechanism, acted more like a stick, as it placed a price on carbon emissions to force companies to reduce them. But since then, Brussels has been seeking to offer more carrots, progressively elaborating new plans and drawing up laws to support industry on this journey. Repower EU is the EU's more recent energy plan. It aims to secure energy security by encouraging the development of clean energy. The objective is to achieve a 42.5% renewable energy share by 2030. Meanwhile, the Clean Industrial Deal seeks to boost industrial decarbonization without affecting our business's competitiveness. It comes with a toolbox that aims at supporting domestic production, financing the necessary technologies to meet these targets, and protecting European industry against foreign competition during this transition period. It focuses on strategic sectors such as steel, chemicals, metallurgy, clean technologies and batteries. These initiatives have led to a series of new laws in recent years to help EU industries to compete while continuing on their decarbonisation path. These rules aim to help European manufacturers produce more clean tech in Europe by removing barriers, making it easier to build new factories and scale up production, attracting investment in green industries, encouraging demand for cleaner, low-carbon products, and speeding up emission reduction projects. They also ensure that certain important goods made with higher greenhouse gas emissions outside Europe face carbon costs similar to that paid by European producers, helping to ensure fair competition in the European market. Avešank Lukas, head of the European Commission representation in Estonia, explains.
The industrial accelerator is part of a broader policy process in which we have taken as a basis Mario Draghi's report on the EU's competitiveness and Enrico Letta's report on the functioning of the single market. The goal is to better leverage the single market and strengthen our competitiveness. In particular, the Draghi report outlines 3 key pillars: innovation, decarbonisation, and its alignment with the competitiveness agenda and economic and military security.
It brings in a Made in the EU rule, which we talked about last time, and requires public procurement to include low-carbon requirements. Carola Hermoso is the General Director of UNICID, the Spanish Steel Association. She welcomes this initiative.
The signal that this would send, a preference for European steel, is very important, as this would ensure demand, or at least a portion of it, provide some stability to the European market, and send a positive sign to investors so that they make those investments that are so important at a global level.
So it seems that as time goes by, the interests of the EU, its member states and its industry are increasingly aligning, aren't they? Obviously, this trend is also mostly down to global market forces. Companies all over the world are realizing that the future is going to be all about batteries, clean tech, hydrogen, electric vehicle infrastructure, heat pumps, advanced materials, and low-carbon manufacturing. But for industrial electrification to make sense, a country's national grid has to be equally green. And here, some member states are lagging behind, failing to transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energies and even potentially nuclear power. Meanwhile, full industrial decarbonization cannot be achieved through electrification alone. The steel, chemicals, metals and cement industries, amongst others, find it more difficult to reduce their emissions because their operations often require very high temperature or involve chemical processes that generate greenhouse gas emission as byproducts. We previously heard from Carola Hermoso from Spain's steel sector. She explains the cost involved in decarbonizing the steel sector.
We are talking about billions of euros because, in fact, the steel industry is responsible for 7% of global emissions. And we are very aware of our responsibility to ensure that steelmaking processes emit fewer greenhouse gases.
Brussels' plan for a clean industry does acknowledge that not all sectors will be able to transition fully to electricity. Nevertheless, these sectors are considered key to the EU's industrial future because they provide the materials needed to build Europe's economy, including materials to develop clean tech, infrastructure, defense and manufacturing. So in order for them to meet European carbon commitments while remaining competitive in the global economy, alternative options such as carbon capture and hydrogen utilization are being implemented or considered. The aim of carbon capture, for example, is to prevent CO2 emissions from reaching the atmosphere, storing them in the ground instead. But not all EU countries have equal means or motivation to provide state aid, of course. As a consequence, because they're not able to deal with the high cost of decarbonization, some companies end up leaving the bloc to escape EU legislation. Others put the brunt of the cost on consumers, which means that in the end it's every member of that country's society that ends up carrying the financial burden. So to avoid this situation and finance the transition, Bulgaria's Confederation of Employers and Industrialists, or CEIB, has put forward another solution: financial centralization. Executive Director Bojan Mitrakiev explains.
What we at CEIB strongly advocate for the full integration of financial and capital markets across Europe. This would ensure that even if the energy reform faces a delay, our startups and industrial companies are still able to raise capital effectively. If Europe fails to achieve financial centralization while maintaining fragmented markets, successful Bulgarian startups and SMEs that scale up on the European market will inevitably end up listing on the New York Stock Exchange, effectively becoming American companies, a scenario that we have already seen play out in several circumstances. Swifter financial centralization across Europe would help us to offset some of the energy-related hurdles facing our industry.
And he's not the only one to call for this. We've mentioned these key reports, one of them by Enrico Letta. He looked into the future of the European single market to emphasize the obstacles that high-growth European businesses face when it comes to scaling up at continental level, as well as the need for financial market integration, something that we've touched upon last week. In any case, the costs associated with decarbonization remain high, and the sectors claim that having to compete with cheaper imports not subject to the same green regulation undermines its competitiveness. For this reason, companies are calling for Europe to protect its clean and low-carbon technology sector from internal competition until investments begin to bear fruit and these technologies are being rolled out on a large scale. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I mentioned as well, imposes a fee on imports from countries with less stringent climate policies. Does just this, right? Gert Sturman, Managing Director of the East Westphalia Chamber of Industry and Commerce in Bielefeld, Germany, is not convinced.
Regulations at the European level that are poorly crafted, such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism, tend to undermine companies' competitiveness and hinder investments in digitalization or climate protection. Ideally, climate protection efforts should be coordinated internationally to ensure a level playing field. Given the current situation and the sharp rise in oil and gas prices, one could also point out that wind and solar don't have to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. Even though renewables are playing an increasingly large role, the overall costs of our energy system are too high.
As for Hermoso, our Spanish steel industry representative, he opposes heavy-handed and aggressive approaches, such as that taken by US tariffs. Instead, her sector has seemingly successfully lobbied the EU to introduce a tariff rate quota.
We have been asking the EU to protect European steel production, and the good news is that it seems they're going to test a new trade defense instrument. This will involve imposing tariffs, but not in the same way as the US. Instead, it will establish a maximum quota, with a tariff applied above that maximum import quota. This will protect European production capacity, industry and employment.
So from the 1st of July, a duty-free quota of 18.3 million tons of steel per year, the equivalent of 1 month of the EU's total annual steel consumption, and there's the EU. If you're above this threshold, there's a 50% duty on top of that. The idea is that EU industries can meet their needs while protecting the European steel sector mainly from cheap Chinese steel imports. As this episode comes to a close, I note that most of the people interviewed by my colleagues, including business representatives, have come to terms with some of the Green Deal's objectives. But there also seems to be a consensus that its implementation leaves a little to be desired. It is still very fragmented, economically speaking, and costs and burdens are not shared fairly between or even within member states. And finally, its transposition into national law is often delayed. Every time the economy bounces back, several member states lose sight of the urgency of implementing greener yet more restrictive and demanding measures, only to implement them again at the next crisis. So there's still a long list of things to sort out. everything from reforming the financial markets and firmly defending the EU's trade borders to cutting paperwork at every level, turning European laws into national ones quickly and accurately, and supporting the economy as it shifts. Only once all that's in place will the EU's green ambitions and its drive to stay competitive actually have a chance of pulling in the same direction. Come back next week for our third and final episode on the EU's global competitiveness challenges with a new, challenging question. Can we be competitive without accepting migrants? A big thank you to my amazing colleagues Augustie from Lithuanian Žinių Radijas, Clara at Radio Romania, Mart at Kuku Radio in Estonia, Aitana at Spain's Es Radio Castilla y León, Ivailo at Bulgarian National Radio, Zina at German AMS Media, Nikos and Mariana at Sky Radio in Greece, Wojciech from the Europeans podcast, and Monica, who edited this episode.